How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux. It's going to be a little bit different today. Sorry for the episode coming out a little bit late. As you can tell, I have a different background. I'm in my hotel room in Dallas here for an interview tomorrow. And I wanted to make sure to try to get something out to y'all this week. So I've been kind of prepping for this, and I flew here today and was trying to get situated, got myself some dinner, and hopped on to record this. So if you're seeing this on Thursday morning, say a prayer for me for my interview. And what I'm going to do today, it's going to be pretty short, but we're going to have a full episode on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. But I thought, because the internet here is not super great, but I still wanted to try to do something. So instead of doing the full episode, I thought I would do a preview to the episode. So the last hour or so, I've just been kind of working on a preview to not give too much away, but to give you a little bit of a taste of what the full episode is going to be. So thank you guys for bearing with me the last couple months. It's been kind of here and there, and is it going to come out on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or not at all? So thank you for your patience and hanging with me. And I did want to give you an update that Jordan is going to be coming back, not quite yet. In the fall, he's going to have some time away from work, some paternity leave time, and he's going to jump back on the podcast. I'm not sure if it will be weekly or here and there, but Jordan will be back soon enough. And I'm going to try to work out with Gio in the next couple of weeks to get him back on as well. So you guys have fared with me on these solo episodes, and I really appreciate everyone supporting and listening and the feedback that I've gotten. I've really enjoyed doing some of these solo episodes to be able to just go and talk about the scriptures and really do almost these sermon type of episodes where we can dig into the scriptures and really think about them in a different way. And that is what the next episode is going to be. Before we hop in, if you would like, comment, share, subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. That will help us grow. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, leave us a rating and a review. And without further ado, let's jump into this preview. You know, I thought about over the past year or several months that we've talked a lot about different people in the Bible, different stories. We've looked at kings in the Old Testament. We've looked at prophets and disciples. We've looked at ordinary people that God used in incredible ways. People whose lives were changed by an encounter with Jesus. But there's one story that we haven't talked about yet, and it's found in John chapter 4, the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. And if you've been around church any portion of time in your life, you've probably heard this story before. It's very popular. You know, you've heard messages about the living water and about evangelism, about Jesus breaking cultural barriers, or about, you know, a Samaritan woman running back into town and telling everyone that she had met Jesus. And those are all incredible sermons and stories that we've heard. But while I was reading this passage somewhat recently, you know, one sentence towards the end kind of stopped me in my tracks and made me think very differently about myself, about Jesus, about this story, and about us and our culture, and whether it's church or just culture in general. And it's when the woman runs back into town and she says, "Come see a man who told me everything I ever did." And obviously I've read those words before, and they've jumped out to me just in a different way. And as the scriptures do in different points of your life, different things jump out to you for different reasons. Even if you've read that phrase or that story or that chapter, you know, a thousand times, when different things are happening in your life, things jump out differently. You know, I found myself asking a question, and I just found myself just going down a rabbit hole thinking about this question. And that question is, what would it feel like if someone knew everything about me? And I want you to think about that question for you. What would it feel like if someone knew literally everything about you? I'm not talking about, you know, oh, my best friend knows so much about me, they know me inside and out. But I'm talking about like every crazy thought, you know, the parts that are uncomfortable to share, not the polished version of you or your story, or even like the bad moments or periods of your life, but those crazy things where even we ourselves, when we have it, like, man, where'd that thought come from? That's crazy. And we wouldn't want anyone to read our thoughts. I think about that movie. I think it's called What Women Want, with Mel Gibson, and he can hear women's thoughts. And it starts off as this like cool thing, like, oh, I have this in to like get women because I can hear their thoughts. But as he hears truly what people think about him, it starts to kind of turn on its head. And that's what I kind of think about here, is if someone knew every thought, every action, every dark secret, not like I said, not the polished version, not what we put online, but everything, every regret, every failure, every moment you're ashamed of, every prayer you've prayed, through tears. And I think, as we move through our life, obviously maybe you have that one friend that you do tell everything to, but just think about like one person coming up and in a moment knowing all of those things at once. You know what I mean? Like, obviously there's times, even our best friend, where we're going through a hard time and they know about this bad spot in our life, but then all this good stuff happens with that friend, whatever, then you have another bad moment. But just imagine one person like bringing you everything you've ever done, every bad, every crazy thought, all at once, right? Because that's kind of what happens in this story. Like, and the thought is, would you want someone to know you that way, And more importantly, would you expect that person to love you after knowing all those things and bringing them to you? And I think if we're honest, most of us spend our lives trying to control what other people think of us, or at least try to maneuver to make people think better of us. We all have different reasons. Some of us have been hurt before and we're just putting up a wall. Some of us have trusted the wrong people. I can throw up my hand there. Some of us have learned that, once people know certain things about us, they'll begin treating us differently or thinking about us differently. So we become really good at editing our lives and editing our stories. We tell the parts of our story that make us look put together or impressive, or, you know what I'm talking about. Those things that we say up front to make people more impressed with us. And we quietly skip over chapters that we'd rather forget ourselves, and we definitely don't want other people to know. And the more I thought about this question and this story, the more I realized that, maybe one of humanity's greatest fears isn't simply being rejected, it's being fully known, which in turn obviously does create rejection sometimes. Because if people only knew these things, would they still stay? Would they still love us? Would they still see us the same way? And those questions aren't just interesting to think about, but they're deeply personal, right? And I think that every single one of us has wrestled with them at some point. And the beautiful thing is that Jesus steps right into those questions, right into those moments, right into those experiences that we've had that we would like to forget and we don't want other people to know. And what's amazing about this story in John chapter 4 isn't just that Jesus knew the things about this woman that no one else knew, and that, she probably didn't want anybody else to know. It's what he did with the knowledge of what she had done in her life. Because knowing someone and loving someone are not always the same thing. Sometimes the more we learn about people, the harder it is to love them, right? Sometimes one mistake changes the way we see someone forever. And sometimes one bad decision becomes the only thing we remember about a person's life. I've experienced that, and I honestly can't remember if I've shared this on the podcast before. And as always, I won't use names, but, when I was a teenager, I made some mistakes with a girlfriend in high school, and we were both part of the church, and it was very public, what happened. And it was one of those things where, sure, it was sinful and what we did was bad, but it was made out to be, this crazy thing. Like, I feel like it was treated as if someone, like had an affair or something like that. It was married and had an affair. And obviously what we did was wrong and sinful, but it was just held up as, I think I've shared this part of the story, is that, after things came out, I felt like the Scarlet Letter. Like I felt like that story literally of the Scarlet Letter when I would walk into church or be around people from my church. And I share that to say is that, you know, 15 years later or so, I was visiting my sister's church, who happens to have a couple that was in the church with us when we were growing up, when I had made those mistakes with my girlfriend. And I was visiting that church where my sister was at. And long story short, I was asked to do communion last minute because the person that was supposed to do it didn't show up. And so I kind of volunteered and said I could do it. So this was not the church that I was a part of. So I didn't really know a lot of people there outside of my sister and a few other people in the church. And, I did the communion. And afterwards, one of the women who was in our church growing up that kind of knew about the situation from me from 15 years ago, was talking to my mom, and she was like, man, Chase did such a great job with communion. And then she kind of added at the end, she was like, which is great, all things considered, with the things in his past, which was, again, like 15 years ago when I was a teenager. And I'm like nearly 30 years old at this point, or maybe mid 20s, whatever it was. It was 10, 12, 15 years after. And what I mean by that is that, that was one mistake that I made as a teenager. I was literally a sophomore or junior in high school. And this person took that one action and basically was still somewhat punishing me for that. And I'm not saying they meant it super maliciously, but it was just the way that they brought it up out of nowhere. That's what I mean, right? Is that that's just one situation in my life and that person. And now, I still struggle, like, do I even want to be around that person? Do I even want to interact with that person? Right? Because of this one bad action in my life that's been held against me. And then therefore, I'm, having some sinful thoughts about that as well, which is my own fault in my own side of things. But that's kind of what I mean, right? Is that one action can change how someone sees you forever. And clearly this person still remembers that from years ago. And it didn't even affect, when I saved my girlfriend, it wasn't like her daughter or something like that. It was not. It was just some another random person in the church. But Jesus isn't like that, thankfully. And when I say that, he's not like me in my reaction towards that sinful thing, and also not like that person. And that's something, there's something so radically different about the way he loves people. And it completely changes the way that we understand grace, or it should completely change the way we understand grace. And I don't want to give away too much of the episode because we're going to spend, the next episode unpacking the story together. So, we'll slow down that story and we'll walk through it a little bit. And we're going to look at the details that sometimes are easy to overlook, or at least for me, I saw in a very different way. And we're going to, ask why Jesus intentionally walked through Samaria, talked to this woman, why he came to the well when she did. We're going to explore why Jesus asked certain questions, even though he already knew the answers to those questions. And most importantly, we're going to discover what this encounter tells us about the heart of God, the heart of Jesus. Because I think many of us have believed lies about God without even realizing it. We assume that he's, keeping his distance because of our sin, or we've assumed that he's disappointed in us. We've assumed that, if he really knew everything about us, he would love us a little less, when we know he knows everything about us and loves us more than we could ever imagine. The opposite is true sometimes of what we think. God, who knows you most completely, is also the one who loves you the most perfectly. And so that's the question that we're going to wrestle with. And I genuinely believe that the conversation isn't for people, who feel, isn't just for people who feel close to God. It's for people who are carrying shame, for people who are convinced that they're too far gone, that God wants nothing to do with them, for the person who's pretending everything is okay, and the person who's wearing a mask. For anyone that's ever wondered if grace is really as good as we Christians claim it is, it's for you as well. So I hope that you'll join me next episode. We're going to open to John chapter 4 and walk through that story. If you want to read that story before the full episode comes out, so you can kind of get the context, or maybe freshen up on the story if you haven't read it in a while. But I really am looking forward to walking through that with you. And so that's just a little preview. So again, thank you guys so much for listening, for sticking with me and Jordan and Gio as we figure things out. And I hope to get more polished and be able to make this podcast something bigger and widespread and really help people. And as I embark on a new journey, whether I get this job or not, if I get it, I'll be moving. I don't know where yet, but please be praying for me. And, the goal is to continue to do the podcast. And after all this settles and I figure out, where I'm going, or if I'm staying in Charlotte, then I'll kind of know if it's going to still be able to be weekly or if I'm going to have to work out a new schedule. But I just wanted to hop on and make sure I gave something to y'all this week, because I've made the promise that I want to try until I figure all this out with the job. I want to try to make sure I have something out for you guys every week. So I love you guys. Thank you again. And as Jordan always says, I'm out. See you next week.